As we focus on research within the forest sector, it's important to remember that not all knowledge comes from the same place, and how we generate knowledge can be vastly different across different communities. To look at how we might have a more pluralistic approach to knowledge production, I'm absolutely delighted now to be joined by John Boakye-Danquah and Kalpana Giri. Well, first of all, thank you both so much indeed for joining us. We really appreciate that, so thank you.
Appreciate.
So first question is, what are the limits of what we generally consider knowledge about the forest sector?
I think forest science has long been conceptualized as a science that maximizes wood production, and its premise has remained as such till date, despite the different practices that we actually see in forest world, where it's not just about wood maximization or timber production alone, but it's also about culture, it's also about spiritual practices, it's also about food, it's also about water, it's also about a place of belonging. So I think there is a mismatch, and that mismatch has not been captured by forest science.
Overall, science has really recognized that the way we talk about science and how it's produced is really quite limiting. And what we haven't been very successful at doing is how do we integrate the other forms of knowledge? Because the moment you talk about science, that means that we're excluding a lot of other forms of knowledge that might be either experiential, the way indigenous people manage the land and all that is quite limited. But more importantly, how the whole scientific enterprise is organized is also quite exclusionary. So exclusion around regional lines, around gender, around race, and therefore what is considered limit is likely to be limited based on who is benefiting, who is practicing, who is contributing. And so I think we need to look at it from the way we generally talk about how knowledge is produced and really putting more approach and knowledge to the way that we encourage other things to come in.
And John, what defines a forester?
That's a very tough question, because what defines a forester, forestry is a very broad field, right, with many different sectors that participate. But professional forestry in this sense might require that someone goes through education experience and then accredited. Now, but what we realize what happens is that that process doesn't really, it's quite limiting, because in the first place, there are a lot of people who I work in Canada, who are immigrants, who might have studied forestry, worked in forestry for a very long time, and then their credentials are not recognized. So that is quite limiting. But there are also people who I've talked to a lot of young women who go through all the accreditation process, but then they start working and people question their values and even whether they are real foresters, right? So I think the question about who is a forester, we have a traditional understanding who a forester is, but we know that forestry is evolving, it's more knowledge-based now, and therefore it's important that we need to really change that definition of who a forester is, yeah.
I love your answer about a real forester. So, Kalpana, when we talk about knowledge in forest science, how different is that knowledge in forest science to knowledge in forest practice?
I think forest science, especially within academia, is also evolving. We also have to acknowledge that. So compared to perhaps 40 years ago, where a lot of emphasis is only in silviculture and timber, right now I think there are multiple courses that are integrated within the curriculum as well, right? So I think there's growth and there's room for improvement. But I think what really gets around that is, I think the point that he also mentioned is this knowledge production process, and what really gets privileged in this process, right? And so in practice, we see that there's a knowledge production process also going on when people are actually practicing forestry and making decisions around that. For example, within forest restoration, which tree species are you going to plant, for what purpose, to benefit whom, and for at what scale? I think these are the important questions where, actors that have more power usually tend to make decisions. And in that process, I think it's a little bit of politics and knowledge that gets mixed, and where marginalized or disadvantaged groups such as indigenous people, local communities, women, even pastoralists, they don't have much say in terms of what they know, how they want to use their forests as well. The forest practice, the way I see it, is more holistic, because it allows you to see forest in its full form and achieve the full spectrum of ecosystem services. Whereas forest science still is more about, like privileging one particular aspect of forest product, while also including the others as co-benefits. So I think that's the major difference.
Well, you talk about things are changing, but why is it important for the two sides of that particular coin to come together?
Precisely because I don't think it's exclusive to each other, right? I think it actually blends. And Forestry is also a very territorial sector in that way. Like when I was in my university, there's a strong identity that we attach by being in forestry schools, and we carry that identity even when we go for work. And detaching that identity that when I'm a forester, it's okay not just to work on wood and timber and carbon, but also on people's need, that requires a mental shift, right? So I think it's very important to rework around that, because there is opportunity for doing that to achieve the fullest functionality of forest.
Well, let's pick up on that point to finish off. How do we get all the potential there for the future of forests?
I think we go back to our alma mater, right? I always say that, yeah, let's go back to universities and have more courses that actually helps the students to see that forests are not just about trees. There's a lot about ecosystem services. It's also about people. It's also about tradition and culture. So if we really give that mindset to people, I think that's where the change needs to begin, and do more collaboration with social sciences and bring creative methods, tools, and approaches of looking at knowledge and mapping that knowledges, right? And then come back like this and talk about it and have a conversation so that we can expand the space where these discussions are taking place.
John?
I think just to add on to that point, other things that we can do is really about making sure that we create conditions that enable people to come to their full self in terms of how they can contribute. Because I think the sector is evolving. We need a lot of diversity in knowledge, whilst really the techniques and the knowledge around how we manage the trees and how we manage, those things have really evolved quite well. I think the next phase of that transition is about how we manage people, right? And I think that is what will get us to really solve the problem that we need to.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us.
Well,
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
appreciate it.